And so I think that there is this tension that entrepreneurs feel, especially people in this audience who have started their own business and feel like, well, I can't get a loan. I'm not doing real estate. I only need money for operations. Like, I don't know how to get this up and running. What I need is some help in that respect. These pilots, they're not gonna help me in any way. So one of the things that you helped me with is that I went to the LDC for a loan for Plum Oyster Bar. I really don't think it's any small. You were at the start of both Jeff and my entrepreneurial journey. And that LDC loan is really, that we would not have survived the winter without that LDC loan. There's just not a chance. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Seriously Connected. I'm Heidi Knoblauch, and today we're going to talk to my friends Jeff Buell and Kevin O'Brien about risk and how to access economic development and banking resources for your business. If you're a woman in business, you should listen to this episode because there are tons of resources that you might not know about, and we talk about not only how to access them, how to partner with people that can help you access them, and what they are. One of the things that I found the most interesting was a realization that I had on the podcast that most of my mentors are men. We talk about why that is and what you can do to develop partnerships to help grow your business. Kevin, it's awesome to have you on the podcast joining Jeff and I. What did you think of the last podcast?
I found it interesting.
I don't believe you.
Anytime I'm exposed to brand new insights about people who I thought I knew well, it's an interesting experience.
I think the text message you sent me had the word navel gazing in it, which is what prompted me to have you on this podcast today. So today what we're going to talk about is your experience in economic development. I think Jeff and I owe a lot to you, even though we might not thank you for it vociferously. But one of the things that I've noticed in economic development is you don't see a lot of women appearing before economic development boards. So you and I met because you were the chairperson of the Troy IDA and LDC immediately before me. So do you just want to tell the audience what the IDA and LDC are?
The IDA and LDC are two municipal chartered entities, one of which, the IDA, the almost sole purpose, the Industrial Development Agency, whose almost sole purpose is to, through the use of real estate and sales tax incentives, incentivize downtown development in its geographic area. That's done two primary ways: sales tax waivers for projects that the IDA finds worthy, and what we call payments in lieu of taxes, where the full taxes on the project under development are deferred for a certain point in time, and instead payments are made annually that, while they're every single time more than the property was paying in current taxes, they're less than the property would pay when it's fully developed. And ideally, at the end of a 10, 15, or 20-year term, the project is paying its full real estate tax as developed. I think it's important to understand that almost 100% of these projects were paying very little or nothing when the risk taker decided to go in and develop the project and apply for a pilot. So it's a way of trying to, like I said, incentivize development in an area where development wouldn't have otherwise taken place. That's an important constraint too. These things, almost 100% of the time, would not have happened without an incentive, period. End of conversation. And we can get into this a little bit later, which is why I have real issues, which I won't belabor here, about the whole notion of tax incentives being some sort of corporate welfare. Nothing could be further from the truth. These are developers taking actual risk on projects that have no guarantee of success, and the only way they can happen is if the municipality supports them. It's funded through money that's thrown off by the IDA and the city and other projects that have happened in the past, and it has a corpus of principle that it uses, I'll use Heidi's term, as a revolving loan fund. It's a basis of principal lending and principal repayment, and that's how it sustains itself. And that can be, on my watch at Troy, it was never a lot of money, but it was was a couple $100,000 or more, and you usually get all your money back. But we used it for smaller scale projects. But the LDC was the lender of last resort. These were unbankable people, unbankable projects often, but 90% of the time we got paid back. So it was a risk worth taking.
It was 90%?
90% of the time. Very few defaults.
When you were the chairperson, I was always curious about this because I worked for the LDC and the IDA in the same city that you chaired, a generation before. What in your head was a success rate you wanted to achieve where you thought you were doing good?
It's interesting you say that. In some cases, it didn't apply at all. Let's take the facade grants. The facade grants, all they were was a drain on our corpus. But to sort of the moral part of your point is, if I can use that phrase, is they were actually doing some good. Yes, we weren't going to get that money back, but some place in the city was going to be improved because we decided to grant that money. Now, we budgeted ourselves how much we wanted to grant as opposed to how much we wanted to lend. I never really thought about success rates because I came, just as a little bit of background here, I came as a lender from the private sector. Part of my career, I was actually a lender, but the vast part of my career, I was a chief credit officer, which was the head umpire. So I just decided what worked and what didn't. But I didn't really, I came into the LDC, lender last resort. I didn't really have an expectation how much we were going to pay back. And I looked at all these loans and I said, gee, it's our job to do them. They're all dogs. But they're dogs because they couldn't get it. They couldn't get that money anyplace else. So that was our role. And to your other point, it might not have been 90%, but it was much more than I thought. It was well over 70%. We got paid back because these people had a commitment to the project and they knew they were lucky to get the loan. That's the thing. They did walk away. Troy, it's not one of these big communities that you hear all sorts of abuses of these public agencies. These were people who were scraping along, trying to do a deal, and they showed a remarkable degree of loyalty to the lender.
So I was going to ask you, we were both risk takers that went to the LDC and the IDA. So I'd like to tell just some stories of you going to the IDA, what projects you brought before the IDA, and why you did that. How did you know to do that?
So, I'm an accidental entrepreneur, right? I worked in government and learned the process and then saw the process and thought I can do this better than other people are doing it. I'm going to go do it myself, which is, I think it's an unusual path for people to jump out of government and into that. You don't see that a lot. But the first chance I took, the reason for the leap was the knowledge I had from working in that area. And I think we talked about this on the first podcast. I didn't rewatch it, so I don't know if it made the cut. But, my first project was, buying a building from the LDC that had a big red X on it in downtown Troy. And
that was like, we were like dancing in the streets when you took that deal because we thought there's just no way. We thought the building was a narrow front. Okay. We thought it was undevelopable. You took an enormous degree of risk there.
If it was wider, it's interesting that Kevin says narrow. If it was wider, it would have already been knocked down and used as a parking lot. But it wasn't. It didn't really have any use. And for me, I saw it as an opportunity because I had when I went to the LDC, I had $8,000 in the bank. I didn't tell anybody. I just cut him a check for $5,000 of it to buy the building and put this proposal in, and like, that's going for it. And then we had it, and it was like, okay, we took out a $50,000 loan from a credit card company, did the demo, and then I went out and got a partner, and then we went through the whole thing of, we got our sales tax abated, and we went and got a pilot, the payment in lieu of taxes, and I really appreciate what you said about taking risks, because the thing that people don't understand, pilots by nature are very boring. I'm going to use the acronym to shorten it, but they're boring, and people just know they hate it because, that guy's getting a break on his taxes and I didn't. But the reality of the math in New York State in particular is that if you didn't have the pilot, your taxes actually exceed your revenue in most cases. So not your operating income, not anything that nets out. Your literal revenue would be exceeded by your taxes. So on that project, we ended up putting $1.5 million. into that building. And $1.5 million for 3 apartments, right? 3 apartments and a restaurant. And the restaurant actually closed last week, 10 years and 6 months after it opened. That's a good run for a restaurant. We're proud of that accomplishment. And, that was worth doing. And I think it was one of these small things inside of, this is why I asked you what you wanted your success rate to be. Because when I was in that space and operating and trying to convince people to do things, for me, it was always a 50-50. If 50% of our stuff succeeds, then in 10 years, we're crushing it.
That's a developer's ratio. A lender couldn't survive on that ratio.
Part, right? Whereas Kevin in his day job had to be 99.9% correct. Right? Like, he can't be wrong.
I used to say to the IDA board more than the LDC board, because those were to the IDA board about pilots, to your point about pilots. If we put every pilot out to a referendum of the public, every single one of them the voters would turn down, every single one, because they viewed fat cats. And there's a columnist in the TU, whose name I won't mention, but you can figure it out, who uses the word corporate welfare, seems to think that every project, some that you've done in Albany and in Troy, developers ought to just do out of the kindness of their heart. They ought to be real risk takers, no guarantees. You just go in there and that's not the way urban development works. You got to remember, I don't want to get too much into real estate here, but real estate is all about supply and not demand. You can supply all the capacity you want. In a place like Troy or even Albany, there's no guarantee, you're going to get demand to beat a path to your door. And so that's where the real risk is. And that's what I think, unfortunately, government doesn't want to talk. They don't want to market these things. They want to market the successes, but they don't want to get into the weeds about pilots because it's hard for the public to understand.
So if you're a founder who is thinking about pitching investors and are nervous about the way that your pitch deck looks, there is a service called Hate Your Deck. Michael Lightman and I are very good friends, and he's developed this proprietary method for putting together pitch decks. And, I do see a lot of template pitch decks when I see founders pitch me, and those pitch decks are not super effective. So if you're interested in developing a very customized deck, you should reach out to Michael at Hate Your Deck. His email and his website are in the show notes. I do know he's going to be offering some live courses soon, which might be a good option for you if you are interested in developing a custom pitch deck. So one of the things that I was actually talking to somebody yesterday, and they had heard our podcast, and on the first 2 podcasts, we talk about entrepreneurial ecosystem. And they said, that's what I'm really interested in, the ecosystem building. And I said, well, economic developers have been trying to, start to do things for entrepreneurs. And he literally went, economic development. And so I think that there is this tension that entrepreneurs feel, especially people in this audience who have started their own business and feel like, well, I can't get a loan. I'm not doing real estate. I only need money for operations. Like, I don't know how to get this up and running. What I need is some help in that respect. These pilots, they're not gonna help me in any way. So one of the things that you helped me with is that I went to the LDC for a loan for Plum Oyster Bar. I really don't think it's any small. You were at the start of both Jeff and my entrepreneurial journey. And that LDC loan is really, that we would not have survived the winter without that LDC loan. There's just not a chance. And the only reason I knew about the LDC, I had no idea that the government was interested in helping me start and grow a business. That's a foreign concept to many entrepreneurs, I think. And so I think, open-ended question for either one of you, how do you see economic development? Not, probably not the pilots of the world, right? But economic development helping entrepreneurs, especially the people who are listening today.
It depends on the gatekeeper for the municipality. There has to be some effort on the part of the municipality to educate the public, the risk takers, people who aspire to start businesses, women. There has to be some forum for that. I think the chamber does try to do something like that. That's right in the middle of their job description. And the city, all the cities are threadbare, but they all have some sort of marketing officer. To me, that's where it starts. The city has to be a gatekeeper for its own sources of capital in terms of marketing them. And then there is a burden on entrepreneurs to educate themselves a little bit too. It's not like this stuff is a secret. The city has websites. You can go there and you can find information about the LDC, at least its existence. But I hear you. There's a gap. It's not perfect. I don't know how you would necessarily fill it. My impression, though, especially since post-COVID and during COVID, the lending environment in terms of there's a lot of capital out there. There was anyway, but there's a lot of capital out there. There's a lot of lendable principal out there and not enough demand. My impression was that market has gotten a little better. Again, I've been out of it for like 7 years, but and you were right in the middle of it. And I have to believe that there's some better access to capital for aspiring entrepreneurs than there was when I was sitting in those chairs.
And I also think, it's storytelling too, right? So Jeff, for instance, you've received many pilots, other economic development incentives, and you have a very interesting commercial base. I mean, it does pass on.
I think at some point I made the determination that with the things that we were working on, it was more prudent for me to go get money for people than for the people to go get themselves money, because I understood it and didn't have to. It was like sometimes you're supposed to teach someone how to fish, but sometimes it's okay to just give them the fish, right? Like if you are talking about setting up shop in a downtown and you want to open up a vegan barcade, real life experience for me, it's better for me to have that person, that entrepreneur, focus on what they are good at than have to spend 6 months learning something they're not good at that I can do in 5 hours, right? And I don't need to teach you to do that because you're not doing it again. And so I love the gatekeeper comment because I think it's true on both sides. And so the reason for some of our success has been that we are able to cultivate a different kind of street front access to our properties. That is what cities need, and that is reputational based of like, oh, they do those things, and it's because we can go to the best gatekeeper in the area. Is Ray Gillen. There's nobody better, and Ray has access to the dollars that make it easier for him to do his job, right?
That helps.
It certainly helps, but he's also aligned with what is supposed to be happening, and so I think educating yourself for sure, but also like, who out there can you partner with, right? Because all of my success has been I've been super lucky with who I've partnered with, right? Who I've been able to go to and say, I need help with this, and not be afraid to say, I need help, I can't do this on my own. And I can't think of a single project I've done on my own where it was just like, yep, I did that, right? I think so. It's really about exploring before you even walk in the door. I think it's really great. What is out there? Because it's not a secret, right? There are dollars out there, but also who can you partner with? And I'm seeing that in my life right now in an extraordinary way. What was small spaces and restaurants and coffee shops is now, hey, you're good at this. I need 50,000 square feet done. And now it's people who are recognizing that that's a good way to do things.
But I think the three of us all see that women often are not the people who are going to the IDA or the LDC, right? So
only if they're an attorney.
Only if they're an attorney.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like I can't think of a single person I've ever seen present as an owner at an LDC or an IDA meeting.
No, I can't either.
No.
And my tenure, I can't either. And I don't know. I honestly don't know how to fix that other than women's support groups sort of pushing. When I was at the bank, for instance, you had state incentives for doing women and minority-based lending. You actually got credit on your state exam for it. So there was a regulatory body trying to prime the pump. When I was at the LDC, and you remember this, it drove the developers crazy. One of the things we had, job creation was a big deal. It's a blunt instrument in terms of regulatory, but it was a big deal. These pilots had to create jobs, and the state audited that. But the other thing was we wanted more than apartments. Apartments didn't create jobs. So we would always insist on a retail component in these projects. And that got very difficult to manage. These developers, many of them, they didn't know how to find retail tenants. These projects were in places that retail tenants didn't beat a path to. And so that got to be difficult. But it was a good faith effort to try and get smaller entrepreneurs somewhere in the middle of these IDA deals. But you can't, another thing, I look back on it, it never quite worked. We talked about it all the time. Maybe you did on your watch too. We wanted to do more deals in the Berg, and we wanted to do more deals in South Troy. We got pretty good at North Central because there were all these big, hulking buildings that developers, were interested in turning into apartments. But you had to have real risk takers in those two neighborhoods, and they just never came forward. I look back on that and I say, these are the areas, boy, we got apartment buildings one after another in North Central and in the downtown area, but nothing in the Berg and nothing in South Troy. So the capacity of the lenders and the providers of the subsidies to fix this has real limitations. And I don't have a perfect answer.
So pivoting from IDA, LDC, but just economic development as a whole. Yeah. So the same person that, went about economic development said, I went to the person who's now running the economic development in the city of Troy. And I said, hey, I want to do some stuff for entrepreneurs, like, bring them together, have some beers, like, have some coffee. Do you have any money in the budget? And she said, I have a grant to redo the streets. And he was very offended by this, but our podcast, the last podcast hadn't come out yet. And I said, it's very interesting that you say that, because in our last podcast, what we talked about is that in order to have risk, to be able to take risk, you need an infrastructure and safety in order to take that risk. Yeah. And so what I said was, all right, so you need that infrastructure, safety to take risks. That should be a huge part of economic development. But there's very little room for the small risks of, to take an example in Troy, the Tech Valley Center of Gravity wants to do something operational. We'll put some economic development dollars there. I mean, I understand that that's actually not a great example because the Rensselaer County IDA does a fantastic job of supporting them. But just let's imagine there was a subgroup that wanted to do something, a robotics club, something like that. There's very little dollars for that in economic development. So what I'm trying to figure out is, how do you balance these people who are talking about an entrepreneurial ecosystem with the people who are doing economic development? Because economic development, the term that people would use for supporting entrepreneurs is business attraction and retention. That's the economic development term that they would use. I'm not sure that quite gets it, because that still does like some big fish, I guess you don't hunt fish, but some big fish hunting, right? So we're going to bring this big company to the area, to your point, to create thousands of jobs. Whereas entrepreneurs are saying, I'm just me. I might have one other person. I need some operational money to get started. And I do feel like there's a gap. And I'm not exactly sure how to solve that gap, but I'm hoping that the two of you have some ideas.
You want me to take this first? I don't want to get into, in my experience, when I was at the municipality, the things you just described were not mutually exclusive. There was money to do roads and whatever else, and which is a fixation, apparently, of the current administration. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But there was also the capacity to come to the LDC and get small loans for these aspiring entrepreneurs. I don't know where that capacity went. I haven't been keeping track. But they're not the only source. The story you tell should still be compelling to small business lenders at banks. Banks have a ton of capital, a ton of lendable money right now, because there's not enough loan demand. There wasn't enough pre-COVID, and there hasn't been post-COVID. There just aren't enough big and small, not enough risk takers, not enough entrepreneurs. So if an entrepreneur is saying, geez, I tried to do this and tried to do that, I would ask that same entrepreneur, did you go and tell your story to a bank, to find the division that handles this? And we're full of. We got more banks than we know what to do with here, and they've all got a small business arm that their charge is to generate product. I mean, if a bank doesn't lend, they don't make money. So I think there are multiple doors to capital and loan monies, but you just got to knock on all of them. And I'd just be interested in talking to one of these people who's frustrated whether they've done all that knocking. And because it's, there are success stories all over the place of people that started with nothing, like this guy. And, so I don't necessarily buy into the premise.
I'm going to veer away from the government side because I'm not certain that it's the government's responsibility to solve what you're trying to solve for. Other than we are so burdened by taxes here that they have to do it.
Right.
But when you have to do something, it doesn't necessarily make sure you're good at it. But what I want to lean into is what Kevin just said, because I think the hardest thing for an entrepreneur to do, and the one thing they have to get over, is like you cannot be afraid of people saying no to you. So I'm buying a building right now that is like, it's a little crazy, but I'm doing it out of the kindness of my heart. And I think it'll make money in a couple of years. But it's not going to make money for 2 years. And like, I just know it. So when you go to a banker and you say, I know I'm not going to make money for 2 years, but I have enough cash in it and it'll be fine and we're going to do it this way. And so I went to banker one, who I've done a lot of work with. And he likes me. We get along. Fun storytelling. He brings his bank into our big projects. They participate in it. So good enough. And I said, Al, I hope he's listening. I'm doing this building. You already have the loan on it. How about we transfer the loan there? We do it this way. I got creative in my head. He goes, I'd rather keep our capital free for other things you're working on, because they don't like it, right? As I'm telling him the story, this was the other night, we were in the same room at the same time. As I'm telling him the story, another banker overhears the conversation. He goes, what do you got? And I just said, it's an office building. I have a tenant who's paying their first 2 years of rent up front. And it's got a state tenant in it, and it's not going to make any money for 2 years, but year 3, it's going to crush it. Give me a call, right? And so it took a while for me to learn that, right? I think one of the first things that after I bought this building, we demoed it out, the building we started talking about in the beginning, and I had an idea in my head. This apartment can rent for this, and here's my restaurant tenant. And I had an Excel spreadsheet, and I had just come from working for another company, so I knew the numbers worked. But I didn't understand the other side, which is you have an appetite for risk as well that you have to go through. And so I brought it to a bank, and it looks good. Can you send us your personal financial statement? And now imagine this. This is really, like, I love talking about what an absurd person I am. I Googled what a PFS was because I didn't have one, right? I owned a house and I'd been a W-9 guy. And so I looked at it, I was like, oh boy. And so then I started Googling, well, how much money do I need to have to borrow this much money? I was like, I'm not even close. So what did I do? I called a friend of mine who was a developer and I said, I need a partner. And convinced him. I just really want to nail this partnership thing because I think, like, if people are listening and they're out there doing it and they have the best idea in the world, it's likely that if you have the best idea in the world, you're going to need a partner to get it off the ground.
That's a great point.
Here's my charge to you. That I promise you that 90% of the women listening to this, their response to that is going to be, that's not how it works for me.
I disagree.
I disagree too. And I'm not a woman, obviously.
I can't wait to find out, because what they're going to say is you being in a room talking to a banker, being all macho, blah, 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 blah. That's my impression of you. Okay. And then another banker hearing about like what you're working on and offering you to like come in and talk about a loan. I promise you that is not how it works for most women. It's just not. And I think
it's not how it worked for me in the beginning either. The banker that was listening to me, that overheard me, now has a 12-year run of me doing successful projects.
I'll give you an example, right? So you and I were talking one time. I think I was going to a bank for something. And you said, oh, Heidi, like no one has like not lent to me because of my credit report. Or like whatever. You said like...
my credit score.
My credit score.
What my credit score is. I don't know what my freaking credit score is.
Right. Nobody's lent to me based on my credit score. I promise you that every woman, that has been a barrier to them to borrow money.
Okay. Just
yes.
Stop right there. You're talking about a quantitative measure, okay?
I know.
Okay.
And you're
you're saying
Yeah.
I want to be careful. I don't want to come off a certain way on this podcast as clueless about the difference between women face and what men face. But it's a quantitative measure.
Correct.
And for one thing, what you're describing, for starters, is against the law. Okay, for a bank to discriminate against a woman because of a credit score that is the same as a man's, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's, for starters, it's against the law, and banks are very careful about that. But back to the point Jeff made, I think it's important, though, for women to find these women who are ill-served by the system, for lack of a better term, to find partners who will also will augment their own capital. They don't have to give up all manner of proprietary interest in their idea, but it will allow them to access the levers of capital and debt that they feel they haven't been able to access.
I mean, why do you think that I'm mostly friends with men? Why are all my mentors men? It's because those are the people that can actually help me. And I mean, that's just the reality. I mean, that's just the reality.
I think you are. I think you are.
I thought you just.
You're the. I think your experience contradicts your own premise here. Okay, you have been very successful through intelligence, energy, knowing how to access the right levers of capital, doggedness. And you've gotten things done. You haven't said to yourself, "Oh my gosh, I got turned down by this. I'm just going to walk away." I don't think it's just incumbent on women to be determined and dogged and keep pushing. It's incumbent on every risk taker. That's what gets them to where they want to go. I don't know. This guy's a real good example.
I totally agree. Can you give me, how many examples can you give me from loaning out from the LDC to women?
I can't. First of all, I'm as an LDC chair. We weren't in control of that constraint.
I understand that, but
you know what I mean?
I'm just asking how many people came. Can you remember?
Not many. A couple local. Yes, a couple local.
I mean, me.
Yeah, you. There was a woman who ran a bakery that came to us. There was a seamstress up in the east side that came to us. There was, again, we didn't get a revolving door of applicants to start with. Okay, it's Troy at the end of the day, and so maybe every meeting once a month we'd have 2 or 3 applicants. So, but was it a lot? 50%? No. Might it have been 20%? Yes. But there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not sure. The blame is shared here, which is kind of the point I was making. If there's blame to be given, responsibility, societal, institutional, perhaps gender-based bias. There's a lot of things that flow into this spectrum of accountability, but. I naively, I guess, and using you as an example, there are ways, characteristics that define a risk taker that cut through a lot of that stuff.
And I think one of the things to talk about is perception versus reality, right?
So the reality is that that this is not an argument saying that the deck isn't stacked against women. It's stacked against everybody who isn't starting with something. Right? If you are coming into something with nothing, then the deck is stacked against you. And what I'm trying to say is the most important thing, this is not false humility, the most important thing that someone can do is find someone to partner with, to lift them up, and understand that you have to give things away to get that partnership, but it's the only possible way to grow. And I'm still doing it in this moment, right? Like I'm at the point now where I could go do this building I was talking about by myself. I'm not going to. I'm going to bring in 2 or 3 partners to share the load, because that's the way life works, and it's easier when you do it that way. And I think there's a misconception out there right now that is like this false bravado Americana thing that you got to go it alone, and you can't do it alone. Like you just can't do it alone. One of my like the moment my politics pivoted forever was when Barack Obama said, "You didn't build that." And I saw so many people lose their minds about it. And what? And I was like, and I was one of them urging like, oh yeah. And then I was like, wait, but who did build the roads and who did build the infrastructure and how do we do these things? And I think the strongest thing that we can say on this podcast where we're talking to people about economic development and entrepreneurship is find a tribe and get them to go in with you. Because if you're starting with nothing, the deck is stacked against you.
Yeah, I want to stipulate too, as someone on the bank side too, getting a loan can be difficult, perceived as difficult. No less an authority than Joe Bruno once said to me, "You guys, you only want to give somebody an umbrella when it's not raining," and that is the perception a lot of people have. I think banking has changed enormously, but there is still a perception that the door is only half open at a bank. And I think banks have tried to go a long way. You should know, you were in the business for a while. They've tried to go a long way to address that impression and to actually come across with funds for people who are aspiring to do more. But I'm not going to minimize the impression people have of banks. But the days of Mr. Potter are long gone. There's a lot more George Baileys out there,
And I think
I love that.
I think also there's there's what is interesting to certain populations is very different, right? So I don't see a lot of women starting businesses where there are hard assets. I just don't. I see a lot of women starting businesses where there's operational money. And so I think that is truly a gap, right? I don't think it's necessarily, I'm not trying to imply that it's discrimination in any way. What I'm saying is that in the same way that your lender said to you, I'd rather keep it like that, women get that a lot, right? And their next reaction is not, to your point, well, let me find someone who's going to say yes. It's, oh, that person said no. And so this is a bad idea or this isn't going to work. And so I think that is the societal piece. I'm not saying that banking necessarily needs to change, right? Bankers have certain mandates and things like that. I'm not saying that that's what needs to change. But there is something that needs to change, and that perception versus reality, I think that's the biggest thing that we can talk about.
I don't mean this facetiously, but I think it'd be an interesting counseling, somewhere between counseling. You ought to start a therapy group to counsel women who've been turned down for loans and reinforce the sort of difficulties they have to get over that they can get over, but while also not minimizing the disappointment they face when they get turned down for that first time. I'm not minimizing that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but they need to, women who find themselves in this position, again, you are such a wonderful example. You disprove your own premise, but they need to get reinforcement from people who've managed to cut through all this crap, because you can cut through it. Even a woman can cut through it. Any woman can cut through it. But I agree with you. It doesn't happen often enough for a whole bunch of reasons. Maybe a lot of them societal, a lot of them institutional. But it does happen.
So hi, I'm Heidi, belated introduction. I'm a consultant. I typically work with economic developers and founders and other people who are interested in building out an entrepreneurial ecosystem. If you would like to work with me, find me at my website, HeidiKnoblauch.com. And that's linked in the show notes. I mean, for both of you, I go to you with my failures all the time. And you often say, you gotta just all right, you made that choice, now you gotta do this. Or like, well, there's gonna be another opportunity or whatever the thing may be. And I said it very in a joking way, but I was realizing it while we were on this podcast, is that most of my mentors and most of my friends are men. And I think that has served me tremendously well in terms of having partners in life. Like, when something goes wrong and I call Jeff, he's like, well, that is what it is, and you just got to move on, which is, I think, not the experience I would have with other people I've known in my life. When I call you and something has gone wrong, like, when I called you when I was leaving Redburn and I was like, oh my gosh, my life is over. It's going to be in the paper. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do. You were like, it's fine. Sometimes people leave jobs.
I told her she wasn't going to make it 3 weeks.
I just like I was amazed I was amazed with both women who I know very well that you've hired. I was amazed they went. Did you hire Monica for a cup of coffee too?
Monica stayed for a year and a half. Yeah.
But anyway, I just as a side here, Pat's going to listen to this and she's going to say, you came off as such a freaking sexist. I mean, you defended every institutional barrier that there is to women. I hope I'm not sounding that way, because that's certainly not my intention.
Kevin, I feel like you have a very interesting point of view, though, because you were in banking for really your whole career. And at a certain point, women were not even allowed to take out mortgages, right? So the banking industry has changed tremendously.
Yes. I got to believe, I'm not sure, but I think it was not until, I know it wasn't in 71 or 72. We were married in 71, and I know that situation existed then. I think it was like 78 or 79 where something must have happened from a regulatory point of view that women could not be prohibited from getting credit that they were otherwise qualified for on their own. There was a strong institutional bias, which I hope I've copped to along the line here, a strong institutional bias in the banking system that put women at a real disadvantage. Now, that's going on for generations. Is it reasonable to expect, let's say, women entrepreneurs to take one slice of this thing to overcome that in the matter of 20 years? Of course not. It's just not. And so there has to be some sort of evolution, the burden of which is absolutely on the institution to accelerate rather than on the woman, the applicant. But you're absolutely correct. There's strong institutional bias that existed for a long time that lenders really weren't even aware of in some ways. And there are some things out there right now that are very disturbing, trying to push that back in the other direction, coming from government. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion for a whole other podcast. But yes, so trying as institutions to overcome things that have been part of your fabric for as long as you can remember depends on new generations of people coming in and sitting in the same seats that the people who harbored the bias that they sat in over the years. I got to believe that's happened. First of all, not for nothing, a lot more women in the banking business these days. Again, as someone who disproves your own, premise, people like you are uniquely positioned to throw your weight around institutionally. And as you know, institutions aren't for everybody. They can get boring, they can grind, they can get slow. But that's where changes can be made by women sitting in decision-making seats. Is there bias in hiring? I don't know. Never was with me. But is it out there? Sure, probably. But every time I turn around, Ruth Mahoney, isn't she still, local president, the woman who just retired from Key, which is enormous, So there are a lot of women out there who've risen to the top or in positions of significance of regional banks. And there are a lot of women in customer-facing roles. And that's where it kind of starts. A woman comes in and applies to a woman, just a funny little story, Pat, my wife, likes to buy cars on her own, and this almost goes to the banking thing too. She really looks for a dealership that has a woman salesperson because she finds that the male salespeople, the last last refuge of a sexist, I suppose, the male salespeople are unbelievably condescending. When you bring your husband in here, honey, stuff like that. But, so she looks for, places that have female salespeople, which are almost none. That isn't really true in the banking industry. Bankers, there are a lot more customer-facing women there. That goes a long way to dealing with what you're describing. I wish it was the end of all this. It's not. A lot of other things have to happen.
Just think about the concept that my mom would not have been able to buy a house. Is I think one of the things that you and I often struggle with is the world is moving very fast, but we're not catching up at the same rate of speed, right? So Kevin made a great point about, Does it change in a generation? Does it change in 2 generations? Well, no, it doesn't, right? And I think you're seeing women rise right now in a place that I didn't think was ever going to happen, and it's happening to a degree where people are getting excited about it, which is women's sports. And there is now money flowing into women's sports in a really wild way. And what's happening there is that people that are on the tertiary of the business are realizing there's a gold rush that's available because we haven't invested over here, and it's women. And it's like it's starting to catch up. But we want it to happen faster. And so many of the questions that you're asking as part of this whole podcast series are born from a place of, can we just make this better? Like, can I just wave this wand and make it happen? And we're just really slow to evolve. And our slowness is probably normal, other than it's juxtaposed against this really fast environment now, driven by a social media that makes you want to have things happen right now. And maybe this is just normal what we're going through.
I don't know. I mean, I think that I hear so many women reach out to me. I don't know what to do. I'm an entrepreneur. I don't know where to go. I mean, there are government institutions or quasi-government institutions, the Center for Economic Growth being one of them, that's trying to map out for people, hey, these are all of the resources, right? Those efforts get, you see them in waves, right? Like someone makes a map or someone like lists all the resources, right? But what people are craving is some dynamic database, some dynamic website where they can go and say, who do I go to for this? Like, is it Pursuit? Is it this? Something that I wish I had known about is Pursuit has that fantastic lending program. They'll lend you, I think it's up to 100,000. I forget what it is, but they give you all these services with it. People should just take out a loan just to get the marketing services with it. It's these types of that's an economic development program. That's truly an economic development program that people, I feel like, don't really know about. And I do think there is this, I agree that it's a shared burden. I really do. I agree that it's a shared burden. But if we talk about, okay, men have had these opportunities to borrow money, to do this for this many years, right? So they're this much farther ahead. For me, unless I'm partnering with a man, I don't have access to many of these things, no matter how much I Google, right? It doesn't matter how much I Google, because I think the three of us know the thing that is most impactful, or at least has been for me, the most impactful thing to moving forward is personal relationships, where you build partnerships and you use your relationships to drive it forward. But if you have a whole set of subsection of the population that can be farther ahead just by virtue of things that they've had access to, I mean, I agree that when you're starting something from nothing, that is that puts you at the back of the line for sure. But if you can, tap your buddy who's a third in line and say like, hey, can I cut you here? You probably get ahead a lot faster, right?
And then there are the angels. We haven't even talked about the angels. Do women even know that funding source exists? And, how do they access that? That's a whole other. I do have to, you remind me of a story. I'm going to be careful how I tell it. Just a little joke, because I know Pat's going to listen to this. We have a friend who's in the broadcasting business, and he was thought he was in line for a fairly high profile, among others, high-profile anchor seat. And instead, the anchor seat went to a woman of color. And I asked him about it, and he said, white guys have had a pretty good run. And so, it's just that women are coming into these positions now in more of a, with more frequency. And so I think, society seems to be adjusting to it. And Jeff made a good point, too, about right now, women's basketball, largely on the shoulders of, one person, is attracting enormous crowds. These women, and soccer went through this, too, and they just fixed it. These women aren't getting paid anywhere near what these guys in the NBA are getting paid, yet they're filling the same arenas, they're getting the same sponsors. So what will happen is, in a few years, that will fix itself. Should it have to take a few years? No, but it isn't going to take a generation. And, how does that translate into what you're talking about? I really think it's trying to touch these women. Maybe you drag a banker with you. Maybe you drag someone from the Center for Economic Growth. But there has to be forums. Someone like you should start them, where you invite women entrepreneurs and say, look, it's all right. Let's all get all this off our chests. What's happened to us, our own experience. But here are tangible ways you can deal with that. People who probably won't say no to you. I can't guarantee they won't say no to you. It all depends on the variables in your business. But they probably won't say no to you because at the end of the day, one of their underlying goals is to lend more money to more women or give more grants to more women. I know that was out there when I was in the business, that you had to be touching more because of the women and minority lending things. Now I think it's even more prevalent. That's not to dismiss any of the episodes you're talking about, but I do think it's more a matter of trying to put the people together, the right people together.
And trying to put the deal together too. I mean, I think the number one thing that I see with my students for sure, the number one problem is that they don't think big enough. So it's very difficult to put together. So you mentioned angels or, angel investing. So someone's taking equity for, someone's taking a stake in your company for money that they're going to give you.
You're partnering.
Right.
That's true.
Right.
You're partnering. Right. That's 100% true.
Right.
But it's knowing what is an appropriate deal to do an equity-based financing versus an appropriate deal to do debt financing is something that I think people that is not common knowledge. That is like, I promise you, definitely not common knowledge, right?
I have no doubt.
And so I think the way that I learned that, it's not like I took a class on that, I had one-on-one interactions. I remember I came to you and I said, the LDC has this revolving loan fund. I think it should also have a seed fund. What do you think? You were like, you're out of your mind. You got a lot more problems than, you got King Fuels over there. So
You're different. And I'm not just, that's not to say you're different from women. You're different from people in general. You ask me the weirdest questions and you never tell me why you're asking it. You just ask me a question and then I'll answer it. And then you'll tell me why you're asking it. And then you want a different response. So I'm someone who, in my business, I would say at this point, probably over 100 people that have individually invested in the projects that we've done, to the degree of, I would say 100 people that have invested $100,000 or more. It's a significant amount of money, tens of millions of dollars invested in stuff we've done. I have no idea what I was supposed to be asking for at any point. I never learned it. I never took a business class. I just sort of went for it. And I partnered with people who I could ask questions to. I just want to keep hammering that partner thing because I feel like I don't want to give people a false sense that what you're talking about is even solvable.
What I think is that there needs to be an acknowledgement, right? Like there needs to be an acknowledgement that certain people have power and you need to go to those people who have power in order to partner with them for certain things.
Sure.
But men and women have to do that.
Yes.
Period.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes that is for women, it's not partnering with another woman. Oftentimes.
I accept that.
I would agree with you completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Yes, the deck is stacked in that way. Yes, that is interesting because I'm sitting here from the male perspective saying I went to a bunch of men and I asked them for help.
Right.
Yes.
You probably haven't encountered a female loan officer in your career.
I have two of them actually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Right now. But at this point, loans for me at this point, Kevin, are I strategically have to partner with people to meet liquidity requirements and to understand, basically those things. But people make loans to me because they believe I'll solve the problem, right? And if you get in trouble, all right, he'll figure it out, right? And that is born out of I've screwed up so many times, and I had to solve the problem that you've created a roadmap for how to get out of trouble, and that's what any lender really wants to know, right? Am I going to get my money back? And I'm giving this person the money because I know that I will eventually get my money back. And that is the number one thing. That's not a real estate thing. That is a entrepreneur 101. is you need to be able to convince people that they are going to get their money back or they are going to make money.
Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.